The Haunting of Ashwood Manor, Part 1, Segment 1. The rain had just begun when the Carters arrived at Ashwood Manor. It was a thin, misting drizzle, the kind that seemed less like weather and more like breath, soft, persistent, and oddly human. The drive from Oxford had been tranquil enough, though the road that wound through the countryside narrowed until it felt less like a path for travelers and more like an intrusion through the wood's damp heart. Ivy-cloaked trees pressed close to the edges, their branches interlocking overhead in solemn arches. When the manor finally revealed itself, it did so without grandeur, as though emerging reluctantly from the fog. The house was immense, yet withdrawn, its stone facade darkened by centuries of rain, the roof steep and furred with moss. A pair of marble lions guarded the entryway, their faces eroded into near anonymity. Beyond the gate, the garden spread out in manicured symmetry, hedges trimmed to a mathematical precision that felt unhumanely meticulous. Every garden on the estate, they would later discover, looked exactly the same. James Carter stepped from the car first, his shoes sinking slightly into the gravel. He was a man accustomed to reading the weight of history and architecture, but this house pressed on him in a way that words could not classify. "It's older than I expected," he murmured, half to himself. Eleanor joined him, her coat drawn tightly around her shoulders. Her eyes, ever alert to the subtle language of places, swept over the manor's face as though searching for some secret the walls were trying to conceal. "It feels still," she said quietly. "Too still." Sophie, their 10-year-old daughter, leaned against the car door, staring toward the garden. There, at the edge of the lawn, stood a figure of stone, tall, gnarled, and vaguely humanoid. It was carved in a posture of supplication, its head bent forward, its hands clasped as if in prayer. The stone was mottled with moss, and the features, though worn by time, seemed caught mid-expression, a grimace perhaps, or a plea. "Daddy," Sophie whispered, "why is it facing the house?" James followed her gaze. The effigy was unsettling, yes, but not uncommon for English estates of this age. "A garden ornament, I suppose," he said, forcing a tone of reassurance. "Just decoration." But Eleanor frowned. "It's not facing the house," she said slowly. "It's facing north." Before James could reply, a voice called from the doorway, "Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I presume." A man stood beneath the arch, tall and cadaverously thin, dressed in a black suit that looked a century out of date. His face was long and deeply lined, the skin pale as wax, save for the purple hollows under his eyes. He descended the stone steps with deliberate slowness, as though every movement cost him effort. "Reginald Mortimer," he said, extending a hand that felt cold even through the rain. "A pleasure," James said, returning the handshake. "We're very grateful for your assistance in arranging everything." Mortimer inclined his head. "We take great care in maintaining our community," he said, and there was something almost reverent in the way he spoke the word. "Ashwood Manor has traditions." He ushered them inside before the drizzle could thicken into rain. The foyer was vast, lit only by the gray spill of daylight through stained glass. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and beeswax. Portraits lined the corridor, former owners perhaps, but every painted face bore the same peculiar detail. The eyes were turned slightly aside, never meeting the viewer's gaze. As Mortimer led them through the manor, his steps echoed with hollow certainty. "You'll find Ashwood to be peaceful," he said. "The residents are quiet, the grounds well kept. However, the association does have regulations. We find they preserve harmony." He stopped before a small writing desk in the front hall and withdrew a leather-bound volume from the drawer. Its cover was cracked with age, the title embossed in flaking gold leaf. "Regulations of the Ashwood Homeowners Association." Mortimer placed it in James's hands with solemn gravity. Every household receives a copy, he said. Some of the rules may seem quaint, but I assure you they are essential. The association enforces them without exception. James thumbed through the pages, expecting mundane ordinances about noise levels or hedge maintenance. Instead, the text was archaic, almost ritualistic in tone. Rule 4. The garden effigy must always face north. Rule 7. All windows must be locked by the hour of dusk. Rule 9. Should a figure in a crimson cloak be seen upon the grounds, no acknowledgement is to be made. He frowned. These can't be serious, he said, glancing up. Mortimer's expression did not change. They are most serious, Mr. Carter. The association does not issue warnings twice. Eleanor looked uneasy, but James smiled thinly. We'll keep that in mind, he said, intending to laugh about it later. Mortimer's gaze lingered on Sophie. Children often sense things their elders cannot, he said softly. It would be wise to follow the rules. The tour ended in the drawing room where the fire had been freshly laid. Mortimer took his leave with a stiff bow and vanished into the mist as quietly as he had appeared. For a while the house was still. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows with a dull insistence. Eleanor busied herself unpacking, Sophie explored the grand staircase, and James sat at the writing desk, the book of rules open beside him. He couldn't help but feel as though the house itself were listening. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Eleanor lingered by the window. "Do you hear that?" she asked. James joined her. The sound was faint but distinct, a low scraping from the garden, like stone against stone. When he looked out, the fog had thickened into a gauze. The effigy was barely visible, a gray silhouette among the hedges. "It's probably just the wind," he said. But even as he spoke, he thought he saw the figure tilt, ever so slightly, as though turning its head. By morning, the effigy faced directly north again. Eleanor swore she had seen it angled toward the manor the night before, but James insisted she was mistaken. Yet both of them paused when Sophie came to breakfast with a sheet of paper clutched in her hand. It was a drawing, crude, childlike, but unmistakable. The garden effigy, its head twisted too far, its mouth open in a scream. "I dreamed about it," she said simply. It was whispering something. Eleanor reached across the table, her face pale. "What did it say, darling?" Sophie hesitated. It said, "Don't look at him." Part 1, Segment 2. The fog never seemed to lift around Ashwood Manor. Even when the morning sun pushed through the clouds, the light that touched the estate felt weak, as if the fog consumed its strength before it could reach the ground. Each day began the same way, gray, quiet, suspended between wakefulness and dream. James tried to busy himself with work. As a historian, he told himself that a new house, no matter how old, was only a matter of context and adaptation. He set up his study in the library, a cavernous room with mullioned windows and shelves of forgotten volumes left by previous owners. Yet the air inside never seemed to warm, even when he lit the fire. The smell of old paper and dust mingled with something faintly metallic, a scent that clung to his clothes long after he left the room. Eleanor, meanwhile, spent her days attempting to make the house livable, dusting portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her, rearranging furniture that always felt subtly wrong no matter how she positioned it. Sophie kept to her room mostly, sketching in her notebooks or watching the mist move outside her window. 3 days after their arrival, the first real sign came. It appeared on the doorstep one morning, a pie, perfectly round, resting on a porcelain dish as though placed there with care. The crust was golden, the edges scalloped with precision. No note, no ribbon, no sound of retreating footsteps. "Someone must be welcoming us," Eleanor said uncertainly, though her voice held no conviction. She carried it into the kitchen where the morning light struggled through the fog-stained glass. James examined it skeptically, a neighbor's gesture, perhaps. But when Eleanor sliced into the crust, a rancid stench filled the room, an odor of rot and decay so sudden it made her gag. The filling was black, oozing, threaded with something like sinew. The crust crumbled under her trembling hand. Sophie, standing in the doorway, whispered, "It has claws." They all froze. Inside the foul mixture, thin ridges protruded, curved and sharp. Not quite bone, not quite metal. James forced himself to wrap the dish in a garbage bag and take it outside. The stench lingered in the kitchen for hours. By evening, the pie had reappeared on the doorstep, unbroken, untouched. Eleanor burnt it in the garden that night. The flame. Part 2, Segment 1. The storm arrived without warning. All day the air had hung heavy, as though the clouds were waiting for permission to break. By dusk, thunder rolled across the fields, and the first lash of rain struck the windows with sudden violence. The manor seemed to flinch beneath it, every beam and shutter groaning in protest. James had tried to make the evening ordinary. He cooked, spoke gently to Sophie, even poured Eleanor a glass of wine she barely touched. The three of them sat around the table, pretending to be a family untouched by whatever lurked in the cellar, but the air between them was brittle. Each was listening for something else: the creak beneath the floorboards, the whisper in the chimney, the breath of the house itself. Then the lights flickered. Eleanor rose to check the circuit box, but before she reached the door, the power died entirely. Darkness swallowed the room, followed by the slow, rhythmic dripping of rain seeping through the walls. James fetched the lantern from the mantelpiece, and its flame bloomed weakly, barely touching the corners of the dining room. The sound came again, the grinding of stone, only this time it was unmistakably within the house. They followed it to the hall. The front door was still bolted, but across the parquet floor lay a faint trail of wet footprints leading from the direction of the cellar. Bare, narrow, adult. Sophie's voice trembled. "Daddy, it's upstairs now." They froze. From the landing above came the faint rasp of something dragging across the floor, heavy, deliberate, like the slow movement of a body or the scrape of a statue being pulled inch by inch. James forced himself forward, lantern raised. The beam quivered along the staircase, revealing only empty steps, the banister slick with condensation. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. "Lock the cellar." He nodded. Together they moved to the basement door. The key slid into the lock with difficulty. The wood seemed swollen, resisting the turn. When it finally clicked shut, James exhaled, only to see, as the lantern's light wavered, a thin line of moisture creeping from beneath the door. It was dark, viscous. Blood. He stepped back. "It's leaking!" Before he could finish, the floor beneath their feet shuddered, a deep vibration that rippled through the entire house. The lantern flickered violently, casting warped shadows on the walls, shadows that moved even when the flames stilled. Eleanor clutched Sophie close. She breathed. "It's awake. The house knows." By morning, the storm had passed, but the manor was different. The wallpaper in the corridor had blistered overnight, pale patterns of moisture resembling faces pressed against the surface. The portraits, once merely unsettling, now appeared subtly altered, the eyes sharper, the smiles thinner. When James passed the mirror in the foyer, he saw not his own reflection, but a fleeting image of another man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, standing where he stood. The vision vanished the instant he blinked. Sophie refused to leave her room. She said the house was whispering through the walls. Eleanor tried to comfort her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "What is it saying, sweetheart?" "That it's hungry." James turned to the only remaining refuge, the study. He pored over the association's rule book and the priory records he had unearthed, desperate for logic amidst madness. Patterns emerged. The rules were cyclical, tied to phases of the moon, to alignments of stars long forgotten by modern calendars. The effigy was a keystone, an axis around which the rituals turned. He scribbled in the margins, piecing together fragments of the past: the monk's disappearance, the Mortimer's founding of the association, the repeated insistence on containment through compliance. But one entry, handwritten in Mortimer's spidery script, caught his eye. The effigy binds what was buried. Should its gaze be broken, the hollow will rise once more. He read it again, heart pounding. The effigy, its direction, its placement, was not symbolic. It was literal. That evening, while James was lost in his notes, Eleanor stood at the kitchen window. The rain had stopped, but the fog had returned, thicker than ever. She could barely see the garden. Still, something drew her gaze outward, an instinctive pull toward the darkness. At first she saw nothing, then a flicker of crimson. The figure in the cloak stood by the hedge, half shrouded in mist. It didn't move. It simply existed, like a wound in the fog. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Every rational impulse screamed to look away, to obey the rule. But the figure lifted a hand and pointed toward the house. She turned from the window, trembling. "James?" He looked up from his desk. "What is it?" "The cloaked man. He's back, and, James, the effigy is gone." He was already running before she finished. They burst into the garden together. The fog swirled around them, the grass slick beneath their feet. Where the effigy had stood, there was only an impression in the soil, as though the stone had simply sunk into the earth. And then, faintly, they heard it again, the grinding of stone. It came from beneath the house. They tore open the cellar door. The steps were slick with moisture, the air thick with the metallic stench of blood. When James raised the lantern, its light caught on something new. The sealed wall now split down the center. The fissure was jagged, wet, breathing faintly, as though the stone itself were alive. From the gap seeped a slow pulse of darkness, thicker than shadow, rising like smoke. Eleanor gagged at the scent, earth and decay, centuries compressed into one suffocating exhalation. James stumbled forward, holding the lantern high. Inside the crack, something moved, something vast, coiling, soundless. For an instant, he thought he saw an eye. Then the flame went out. He didn't remember dropping the lantern. He only remembered the sound that followed, a low, resonant hum that shook the air and seemed to come from the bones of the manor itself. When he regained his senses, he and Eleanor were back at the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind them. Sophie was there, clutching her sketchbook. "You shouldn't have gone down there," she said. Her voice was strange, too calm. "It doesn't like to be seen." That night, none of them slept. The manor was alive with noise, footsteps pacing in empty halls, whispering voices behind the walls, the sound of rain, though there was none outside. Eleanor sat awake beside Sophie's bed, clutching her hand. The child's skin was cold, her pulse faint. Downstairs, James stared at the fireplace, where the embers glowed faintly red. Shapes formed in the coals, faces, indistinct and shifting, mouthing words he couldn't hear. He rose to shut the window, but stopped halfway. Outside, in the fog, dozens of shapes stood motionless along the garden's edge. They were small, human-sized, each with the rough texture of stone. Effigies. Dozens. Where once there had been one, all facing the house. He backed away slowly, heart thundering, and locked the window. But he knew it was too late. Something had changed. The rules had been broken, and Ashwood Manor had awoken. Part 2, Segment 2. Morning arrived without light. A pall of gray hung over the manor, the fog pressed tight against the windows like the damp skin of some vast organism encasing the house. The clocks had all stopped at 3:07 a.m., their pendulums frozen mid-swing. The air inside felt wrong, too thick, as though the walls were breathing in shallowed and even rhythm. James stood in the study, staring at the fireless grate. He hadn't slept. Eleanor moved about the kitchen silent, pale, her hands trembling each time she reached for a cup or plate. Sophie sat at the table, sketching again in her notebook, pages after pages of dark spirals and hollow-eyed figures. When James approached, she turned the book toward him. "She said they wanted me to draw them right," she said softly. He froze. "Who wants you to do it?" "The ones in the garden. They say the pictures help them remember." Her eyes, wide and distant, reflected something that wasn't just fear, it was understanding, as if she alone could hear the language of the dead murmuring through the woodwork. Eleanor snatched the sketchbook away and shut it. "No more of this nonsense." But her voice faltered. Even she could hear the faint whispering that rose when the book closed, like wind beneath the floorboards, syllables shaping themselves from the dust. That afternoon, James ventured outside, desperate for proof that the world still existed beyond the fog. But as soon as he stepped from the threshold, the garden changed around him. The trees seemed taller, their branches arcing inward to form a cathedral of black limbs. The effigies, no, statues now, stood closer than before. Each bore a different face, yet every expression mirrored the same mute suffering. Some were familiar, features stolen from Part 3, Segment 1. Silence held for a long time after the light died. James could hear nothing but the rhythm of his own breath and the slow, uneven drip of water from the ceiling. The pit no longer glowed. Its surface was black, smooth and cold, as if it had always been there, an ancient wound in the earth that never healed. Eleanor stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. Her skin was gray with dust, her hair matted, but her gaze was sharp, lucid in a way it hadn't been for days. "Where's Sophie?" she whispered. The question broke the silence like glass. James turned, scanning the chamber. Only their footprints marked the dust on the floor. No trace of the tunnel, no sound of footsteps, no echo of her voice. But faintly, impossibly, from somewhere above, he heard a sound. Soft, rhythmic, the lullaby Eleanor used to hum to Sophie at bedtime. He looked up. The ceiling, if it could still be called that, had begun to pulse faintly with light, revealing a new path carved into the rock, a spiral staircase that hadn't been there moments before, climbing into the dark above. Eleanor rose unsteadily. "It's leading us back." Her voice trembled, not with relief but with resignation, as if she already knew the path would not end where they hoped. They climbed. Each step echoed like a heartbeat through the spiral shaft. The air grew warmer, then humid, thick with the scent of soil and decay. The walls seemed to change texture as they ascended, stone giving way to brick, then to wood, then to plaster. By the time they reached the top, they were back inside the manor, or what was left of it. The hall was no longer recognizable. The corridors twisted in impossible directions, stairs leading to nowhere, doors opening into walls of flesh-like wood that shivered when touched. The gas lamps flickered dimly, their flames bending backward as if repelled by something unseen. Eleanor pressed herself against the wall, whispering, "It's folding in on itself." He took her hand. "We find Sophie, then we get out. Whatever happens, we run." They moved cautiously through the corridor. Each room they passed was wrong in some small, sickening way. Furniture sinking into the floorboards, as though being absorbed. mirrors reflecting scenes from other rooms, other times. In one reflection, James saw himself standing in the study, his past self, still sane, unaware of the thing that watched from behind the fireplace. The whispering began again, low and rhythmic. The walls trembled as voices murmured from every direction. Don't look away. Keep the gaze. Pay the debt. Eleanor squeezed her hand. It's trying to turn us against each other. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a soft voice called, "Daddy!" James's ran. The sound led them into the dining hall, or what had once been the dining hall. The long table stretched impossibly far, disappearing into darkness. Candles burned along its length, their flames blue, their wax running like tears. At the far end, Sophie sat in her chair, her small hands folded neatly on the table. She looked up and smiled faintly as they approached. "Are we going now?" she asked. James rushed to her, pulling her close. "Yes, sweetheart, we're leaving." But when Eleanor stepped closer, her expression changed. "James." He looked down. Sophie's dress was soaked through with a dark, sticky substance. Her skin was cold. Sophie tilted her head. "It said I could stay if I wanted, that the others are lonely." Eleanor's voice broke. "No, no, darling, we're leaving." The candles flickered violently. The table began to groan, wood twisting, plates sliding off and shattering. From beneath the floorboards came a slow, heavy thud, something enormous moving just beneath the surface. Sophie looked past them, her eyes wide. "It's here!" The wall behind them split open like skin, revealing the crimson-cloaked figure emerging from within. It moved without sound, its robe flowing like liquid shadow. The hood tilted, fixing its faceless gaze on Sophie. James stepped forward, shielding her. "You can't have her." The figure spoke, voice echoing from everywhere and nowhere. "She was born here. She heard us before she could speak. The house called her back." The lights dimmed until only the figure's faint red glow remained. The shadows it cast moved independently, reaching, grasping. Eleanor held Sophie tightly, whispering prayers she barely remembered. James grabbed a shard of wood from the shattered table, his hands shaking. "Stay behind me." But when he swung at the figure, the wood passed through as though through smoke. The air grew freezing. The shadows tightened around his throat. Eleanor screamed his name. Then, suddenly, Sophie's voice, small but fierce, cut through the chaos. "Stop!" The shadows recoiled. The figure froze. Sophie stepped forward, her eyes shining faintly in the dim light. "You said the rules keep you safe, that if we followed them you wouldn't hurt us." The figure tilted its hood. The shadows rippled. "You broke them." Sophie shook her head. "You did. You moved the effigy. You opened the door." The air crackled with tension. The figure hesitated, as if the words carried weight it could not ignore. For a moment, he thought he saw something stir within the hood. Faces, countless faces, flickering like dying embers. Then, softly, "We only become what you make of us." The figure dissolved into smoke, flowing upward through the cracks in the ceiling. The manor fell silent again. They didn't wait. James grabbed Sophie and Eleanor, pulling them toward the entrance hall. The doors were warped and swollen, but beyond them the night shimmered with mist. Wind howled through the cracks, carrying the faint toll of a distant church bell. He threw his shoulder against the door. It didn't move. Again. Again. On the third strike, the wood splintered. And the moment it gave way, the house screamed. Not metaphorically, the house itself screamed. Every beam and brick shuddering with the sound of something dying or being born. The air turned red. The chandeliers fell, bursting into showers of glass. The floors split open, revealing a labyrinth of tunnels beneath, writhing like intestines. Eleanor clutched Sophie as the staircase collapsed behind them. James dragged them forward through the debris. The walls began to close in, folding like paper. At last they broke through into the night. Rain poured down, washing away the blood and dust. The moment their feet touched the drive, the sound stopped. Behind them, Ashwood Manor stood still, its windows black and expressionless. James looked back only once. Through the mist, he saw a figure standing at the highest window, a child's silhouette, motionless, watching. Then lightning flashed, and it was gone. He turned away, his breath ragged. "Don't look back," Eleanor whispered. They crossed the gates of Ashwood Manor just as the dawn broke over the hills. For the first time in weeks, the fog began to lift. But as they reached the road that led away from the estate, Sophie turned her head slightly and murmured, softly, absently, "It's still inside." The Haunting of Ashwood Manor, Part 3, Segment 2. For days after their escape, the Carters spoke little of what had happened. Silence clung to them like a second skin. Even the rhythm of conversation felt dangerous, as if naming what they had seen might give it form again. They took refuge in a rented cottage near the edge of the river Isis, a modest, ivy-covered dwelling, where the air smelled of wet stone and willow. It should have been peaceful. The windows looked out on slow, gray water. The hearth burned quietly each night. Yet an unease lingered, subtle at first, then constant, like the faint vibration of something unseen beneath the floor. Eleanor spent her days scrubbing the walls, as though cleansing some invisible residue. She burned sage, sprinkled salt, whispered fragments of Latin she remembered from her studies.
Part 4. The Hollow Archive. Darkness had form. It pressed against James Carter's skin with the intimacy of breath, not absence but presence. An atmosphere so thick it seemed to hum. He could not tell how long he had been falling, nor if he had ever stopped. There was no pain, only a silence that throbbed like a heartbeat in the distance. When he opened his eyes, the world around him was neither night nor day, but something between, an eternal dusk suffused with colorless light. He stood in a corridor that seemed to extend in both directions forever, the walls lined with shelves of books. Each spine bore no title, each page whispered as though turning itself. He reached for one and felt warmth. The cover pulsed faintly under his fingertips. When he opened it, the words inside were alive, lines shifting, rearranging, erasing themselves. The historian enters the house. The house enters the historian. James staggered back. The floor beneath him rippled as the water hid beneath the boards. The corridor pulsed faintly in rhythm with his heartbeat, and for a moment he thought he could hear breathing, his own, multiplied endlessly. He walked. No matter how far he went, the shelves never changed. The air smelled faintly of ink, dust, and something older, something like blood left too long in the sun. In the distance, a faint red glow shimmered, calling him onward. He found a door there, carved from black oak, its surface inlaid with symbols he half recognized from the priory's texts. A single phrase stood engraved across the archway, words written in Latin that he could still read despite the trembling in his hands. Archivum vacui, the archive of the hollow. He pushed it open. Inside was a room too vast to exist, ceilingless, for the ceiling was the void itself, a churning sky of ink and shadow. Rows of desks stretched endlessly across the marble floor, each occupied by a figure that might once have been human, but now resembled wax mannequins, frozen mid-sentence, quills poised above parchment that bled black instead of ink. As James entered, the heads of those figures turned, slowly, mechanically, to face him. Their eyes were hollow sockets filled with faint red embers. From the far end of the chamber came a voice, "Historian." It was calm, measured, and oddly familiar, the tone of a lecturer addressing a student. James turned and saw a man seated at a lectern carved from bone. His face was almost his own, but older, paler, the eyes entirely black. The man smiled with James's smile. "You kept records. You sought to understand. And now you will catalog what cannot be forgotten." James' throat tightened. "Where am I?" "In the place between recollection and decay. The hollow remembers all things. Every thought, every sin, every name whispered to the dark. You came seeking truth. Truth is the only thing that never leaves." The double gestured to the shelves. "These are your works. Every thought you ever buried, every word you refused to write, every rule you broke and justified." James shook his head. "No. I escaped. I crossed the river. I burned the shard. You crossed into memory, nothing more. You burned a piece of stone, not the mark inside you." He rose from his seat, moving closer. With every step, his form flickered between flesh and smoke. "Tell me, historian, what is a haunting, if not history that refuses to die?" James backed away, but the room shifted. The desks and shelves rearranged themselves into a spiral, tightening around him. The wax-faced scribes resumed their motion, quills scratching against parchment in feverish rhythm. He caught fragments of their writing as he stumbled past. Eleanor kneels beside the grave of her faith. Sophie forgets her name to remember the house. James records and records, but never learns. The words bled through the pages, staining the marble floor. His own footsteps left prints that pulsed faintly red, as though marking the path back into the manor's heart. He tried to run, but the double's voice followed him, steady and merciless. "You wanted to preserve the truth. Now you are its custodian." A hand, his hand but larger, translucent, reached from the shadows, pressing against his chest. He felt cold radiate through him, deeper than bone. "Each book," the voice continued, "contains a life bound to the house. Mortimer, Wells, the Hollow Men. They linger here because you keep them. You wrote them down. You gave them permanence." The hand withdrew, and in its place a book appeared, its cover still warm, its title etched in letters that rearranged themselves as he watched. "The Haunting of Ashwood Manor," by James Carter. He opened it. The pages were blank except for the first line, written in fresh black ink. The historian awoke in a corridor that went on forever. As he read it, he heard footsteps echo behind him. Turning, he saw another figure emerge from the shadows, another version of himself, identical in every detail, walking the same path, holding the same book. Behind that one came another, then another. An infinite procession of James Carters, each carrying his own record, each whispering the same question to the air. Where does it end? The ceiling above dissolved into darkness, the red light dimmed, replaced by a faint whisper that threaded through the vast chamber like wind through dead leaves. History repeats itself because it must be remembered. Memory repeats itself because it refuses to die. And the historian writes. The doubles took their places at the desks, one by one, quills raised. James dropped the book and fled. The corridor stretched before him once more, the shelves endless, whispering his name. His reflection followed him along the glossy floor, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. He ran until the air thickened again. until the edges of sight blurred and the whispering merged into a single sound, a heartbeat that wasn't his. The light ahead grew dim, and he knew, with the clarity of terror, that he had reached not an exit, but a beginning. A door stood there, identical to the one before, its inscription now rewritten in new words: "Archive complete, proceed to interrogation." He hesitated, trembling. Then he opened it. A scream of wind, a spiral of falling light, a single whisper echoing from every direction at once, his own voice, distorted, hollow. The historian enters the house. The house enters the historian.
Part 5. The Inquest of Shadows. When the door closed behind him, there was no sound, only pressure, as though the air itself had thickened to the weight of stone. James found himself in a circular chamber carved from black marble that shimmered faintly like wet glass. No torch or candle burned, yet the room glowed with a colorless light, a pallid radiance that seemed to rise from the floor rather than fall from above. At the center stood a dais of white ash. Upon it rested 3 tall chairs, each occupied by a figure wrapped in robes of differing hues, one gray as fog, one pale as bone, one deep crimson that bled into shadow. Their faces were hidden behind masks, carved smooth and featureless, save for narrow slits where light seeped through like tears. A voice emerged from nowhere and everywhere. James Carter, historian, chronicler, transgressor, you are summoned to account for the record. He tried to speak, but his throat burned with dryness. What record? The one you made when you named the nameless, said the gray figure, its tone hollow but oddly gentle. Each word a door, each memory a key. You sought to understand the house, you gave it language, and in giving it language, you gave it life. The crimson figure stirred. He believed he was observing. It whispered, but observation is creation. James's pulse hammered. If I am guilty of anything, it's curiosity. I wanted to know what it was, why it killed. Killed, said the pale figure. There is no death here, only continuity. The house endures because you recorded it. You wrote of its effigy, its blood, its child. You made it story, and story does not die. The word struck him like a slow revelation. He looked down at his hands, ink-stained, trembling. The marks weren't stains at all. They were characters, letters etched into his skin, crawling faintly as if still being written. I didn't mean to preserve it, he said weakly. I wanted to warn. Warning is another form of invitation. Every reader is a visitor, every telling a door reopened. A low vibration trembled through the floor. The chamber's walls began to move, slowly revolving like the gears of a vast clock. Between their seams appeared slivers of light showing scenes from lives once lived. Mortimer hunched over the rulebook, Eleanor digging through dust and ruin, Sophie sketching her crimson figure. Each vision flickered like a film reel, repeating endlessly. These are your testimonies, the ones you loved most. You bound them here through remembrance. Eleanor turned toward him within the vision, lips moving silently. He could almost hear her voice, a murmur beneath the hum of the marble. What do you want from me? James asked.
to decide whether you are an historian or an author. The historian records, the author invents. Which one are you, James Carter? He hesitated, and in that pause, the chamber darkened until only the three masks glowed faintly. A rustle of movement behind him, pages turning. He turned to see shelves rising from the floor, endless, spiraling up into blackness. Each shelf held thousands of books identical to his own. Their spines pulsed faintly like veins. The crimson figure spoke again, nearer now, though it hadn't moved. Every account you wrote altered what was. Each correction became creation. Each doubt a seed. You shaped the hollow one as surely as the Priory's monks once summoned it. That can't be true, he said. I'm just a man? The voice cut in. Then why does the house still write itself through you? A sudden wind burst through the chamber, scattering parchment. The pages swirled upward, forming a column of words that twisted into faces. His own, his family's, the effigy's expressionless stare. He covered his ears, but the whispers pressed through skin and bone. Historian, witness, maker, keeper. The gray figure lifted his hand, and the storm stilled. You cannot unwrite what you have written, it said softly, but you can decide how the record ends. How? James asked. The crimson figure's mask tilted, and he realized with a chill that behind the slit was no light, only moving darkness, slow and deliberate, like ink poured into water. By forgetting. The word echoed through the chamber, impossible to contain. To end the house, you must let go of the need to remember. No history, no echo, no witness, no persistence. And what becomes of me? You will dissolve into the silence that came before memory. It is not punishment, it is rest. He looked again at the visions circling the walls, Eleanor's eyes, Sophie's drawings, the river, the house. To forget them would be to erase them, yet to keep them was to let the house endure. The dilemma settled over him like ash. He thought of his wife's last words, "There's nowhere far enough." Perhaps this was what she meant. James closed his eyes. The letters on his skin flickered, then began to fade. The books around him trembled, whispering in countless voices as though pleading to remain. "Let them go," murmured the gray figure. He exhaled, a long breath that carried years of grief, guilt, and obsession. And as he did, the shelves began to crumble, not collapse, but dissolve into dust, their contents unbinding like mist. The marble floor softened into light. The three figures dimmed until they were shadows among shadows. When he opened his eyes again, the chamber was gone. He stood once more in the endless corridor, but now the shelves were empty, the air still. No heartbeat, no whisper of pages, only silence. At the far end glimmered a faint doorway, pure white, pulsing with calm rhythm. He took a step toward it and heard a small sound behind him.
Part 6. The Unbinding of Ashwood. For a long while, James did not move. The book lay open at his feet, its words breathing faintly like embers. The air was weightless, neither warm nor cold, and yet every breath seemed to echo through the hollow corridors of the unseen. He looked toward the white doorway, its radiance serene, unwavering,
and then down again at the trembling page that bore the sentence, "The historian hesitated." In that hesitation, the world seemed to hold its breath with him. He knelt slowly. The ink pulsed again, darkening, then spreading across the paper in delicate threads that formed new words, writing themselves before his eyes. To forget is mercy. To remember is creation. The script shimmered as if alive, and he felt its truth settle upon him with the weight of revelation. The choice had never been about salvation. It had always been about authorship. He could end the house by ceasing to remember it, by allowing oblivion to reclaim its story. Or he could remember and thus rebuild it word by word as he had done before. A murmur swept through the void, soft as wind through empty halls. He realized it was not wind at all, but voices, the faint echoes of every name, every whisper that had ever crossed the threshold of Ashwood. Mortimer, Wells, Eleanor, Sophie, the priory monks, even the effigy's silent stone mouth. They spoke without sound, yet he heard them in the marrow of thought. We are what remains of remembrance. He rose to his feet, trembling. If I let go, you'll vanish. And if you remember, the voices breathed, you will rebuild us and rebuild what waits beneath. The corridor darkened. The white doorway flickered like a heartbeat fading. He sensed something stirring behind the light, a vast consciousness, ancient and faceless, uncoiling from the silence itself. It was not the entity he had once feared beneath the manor. It was something deeper, the concept of the house, the architecture of dread that his words had given form to. The air trembled as a shape emerged within the radiance. It was neither man nor ghost, but outline. An absence shaped like James himself, made of living void. It regarded him not with eyes, but with awareness, a mirror without reflection. Historian, it said, not with a voice, but through the vibration of every thought he had ever written. You have stood between fact and fiction too long. Choose. He stepped closer, feeling the pull of both directions. Behind him, the dark pages whispering of memory. Before him, the white door promising stillness, erasure. He saw again the faces of Eleanor and Sophie laughing in morning light that no longer existed. He saw the ivy-wrapped house, its windows shuttered against a storm that would never end. He understood finally that forgetting them would be the same as destroying them, and yet remembering them meant feeding the story, keeping the entity alive. Then I choose neither, he said softly. The void paused, as if the entire structure of this afterworld had faltered. James stepped forward, took the book from the ground, and closed it. The moment the covers touched, the world shuddered. The walls of the corridor fractured like mirrors struck by invisible hammers. Lines of light and darkness crisscrossed the air, splitting the fabric of existence. From those fractures poured the memories of Ashwood, rooms, corridors, rain, laughter, screams, each fragment drifting upward like embers escaping a dying fire. He felt himself unraveling with them, each memory that had once defined him scattering into the ether. But there was no pain, only release. Time dissolved, or perhaps it was time that remained, and he that was dissolving. He drifted through the unmaking, past the priory's ghostly ruins, past the effigies now crumbling into dust, past Mortimer's skeletal hand still clutching his book of rules that no longer meant anything. The house itself began to fold inward, its timber sighing like a great animal allowed to rest at last. Windows blinked shut, bricks melted into shadow. The effigy in the garden bowed its head and sank quietly into the soil. And then silence. A silence not of death, but of cessation. In the stillness, he found himself standing once more before a house, but it was not Ashwood Manor, at least not entirely. Its form shimmered, half real, half memory. The ivy no longer clung to its walls. The door hung open upon a dark interior that neither invited nor repelled. He realized that the house now existed only because he did, that he was its last remaining witness and thus its last remaining wall. He took one final breath. "Let it end," he whispered. The house flickered, became transparent, and vanished. He expected to follow it into oblivion, but instead there was light. Not blinding, not divine, simply light. The pale, diffused radiance of an early morning, the kind that touches stone after a long night of rain. A quiet voice, Eleanor's perhaps, or his own memory of her, spoke beside him. "There's nowhere far enough." He smiled faintly. "No," he said, "but far enough for forgetting." And with that, he walked forward into the light, leaving no shadow behind. Epilogue. Months later, a developer surveying the fog-wrapped outskirts of Oxford paused before a stretch of overgrown land. "This one?" his assistant asked. The man nodded, brushing dirt from a half-buried signpost. The letters were almost erased, but faintly, beneath moss and rain, he could still make out the words, Ashwood Manor, sold. He turned away, making a note on his clipboard. The wind rose, gentle but insistent, rustling through grass and hollow trees. It sounded for a moment almost like pages turning. Then silence returned, and the land slept again.